Yeah, I mean, there was a big question this morning as to whether this summit would still happen. After all, it was called as an emergency summit that's very rare in reaction to Donald Trump's tariff threats over Greenland. However, there's two really big questions that they need to settle tonight, and we'll know the answers to by the end of the night. The first one is whether they're going to ask the Commission to prepare the anti-coercion instrument for use against the United States if Donald Trump decides to go ahead with tariffs against the European Union in the end. That is, after all, why this summit was called in the first place, to decide whether to prepare that. And it's still a question that needs to be answered, given the uncertainty that remains even after last night's developments. The other question that they're going to be grappling with is whether the EU should have a united response on whether to join Trump's so-called Board of Peace. Most of the EU leaders have gotten invitation letters to join that board, but so far only a couple Eastern EU leaders have accepted, notably Viktor Orban's Hungary. But no Western European country has accepted, and they need to take a decision about that. Now, as the leaders were coming in here behind me, they're coming in as we speak, we've heard them say that if that Board of Peace is just pertaining to Gaza, they might be on board. The problem is that the invitation letter makes it sound much broader than that, and they're worried that the intention of this board is to dismantle the United Nations, and that they say they could not join up to. So we'll see at the end of the night if we get answers to those two questions. I have to say it's entirely possible that we won't. Council officials I've been talking to have really been downplaying expectations for this summit, saying, well, now that last night we have this announcement, this can now just be a relaxed chat. There's no urgency. But I think plenty of leaders, including Denmark's Mette Frederiksen and France's Emmanuel Macron, are not in the mood to have a friendly chat tonight. And there's plenty of EU leaders in that category.
Yeah, we're seeing live images on the screen, Dave, of the German Chancellor who's arriving. Earlier in the day, Friedrich Merz was in Davos, and there his words seem to err more on the side of caution.
Yeah, we are seeing several leaders now reeling back. I mean, Merz, he is an Atlanticist. He has been very cautious about criticizing the United States so far, as has Keir Starmer in the UK. But we saw both of them be uncharacteristically strong in their reaction to Donald Trump's threat this weekend. But as soon as we had this announcement last night that Trump is backing off his threat of military invasion and his threat of tariffs, Chancellor Merz is kind of backing down. So I think that's the key question here. He will decide, basically, tonight whether the European Commission starts preparing that anti-coercion instrument. And from his change of tone over the last 24 hours, it does seem like he doesn't want the Commission to start preparing it. Now, you might ask, why wouldn't you have the Commission prepare this? You're not actually triggering it. You're just having them get it ready. There's plenty of people who are worried that preparing the instrument is going to provoke Donald Trump and make him immediately rescind taking back that threat of tariffs. They're still tiptoeing around Donald Trump to the extent that they don't even want to prepare this instrument. So that's a big question, and I think Friedrich Merz will be the one providing an answer tonight.
Yeah, let's listen to another reaction just moments ago, that of Poland's Prime Minister himself, the former president of the European Council, Donald Tusk.
Absolutely clear. As a Polish Prime Minister, I will be always very, dedicated to transatlantic relations, and for us, the United States are absolutely the most important partner when it comes to our security, etc. And we always accepted leadership of the United States. It's something absolutely natural. But and this is why it is so important for all of us, also for our partners in Washington, to understand the difference between domination and leadership.
And that kind of encapsulates the bind in which Europeans are in, Dave, particularly those frontline states closest to Russia. They are so dependent on the United States for their security.
Yeah, it's really a bind for Europe's most Atlanticist countries, like Poland, like Germany, like really all of those Eastern EU countries, which have wrapped themselves so completely in American protection. Poland in particular, I mean, you heard Tusk referring to it there, it is a a super Atlanticist country. And so for the Polish prime minister to even ease into those words about the US dominance is something very, very new. We can see that over the past days, through this crisis, the United States has really started to lose even its most staunch defenders here in Europe. The question is whether those countries, like Germany, like Poland, like the Baltics, who are so dependent on the United States, whether they have the nerve to push back against the US. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion here tonight about why exactly Donald Trump backed off of his threat. Was it because Europe showed its teeth, sent those troops to Greenland, threatened the anti-coercion instrument, or was it because of dialogue, measured response? I think we're going to see the leaders tonight divided into two camps on that question.
And Dave, do not go far. We'll be crossing to you for live updates throughout the France 24 debate from that European Council summit, that emergency summit. And with us to talk about it is France 24's Europe editor, Armin George. And yeah, we just heard it in that clip of Donald Tusk. There's a difference between domination and leadership, he said. Is something broken, or can the EU, go back to trying to placate Trump, calling him daddy, this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of EU leaders that won't like the sort of daddy talk, but my impression is that they're still going to be very careful, Francois. They're going to sort of, rather than, pull out this trade bazooka, the anti-coercion instrument, they're going to kind of wait and see, because that's really been their default mode over this whole Trump presidency, is to see what Trump does next. So rather than saying, well, let's have this gun loaded on the table, so to speak, let's prepare the anti-coercion instrument, because it actually takes a long time. It could take months for it to be in place. So in a way, why not start the process right now, right? Because then you actually have the gun loaded onto the table, rather than just saying, well, we have these instruments, But I think caution is still pretty much the watchword. Yes, of course, there are some countries like France that would want a more muscular approach, but when you try to get 27 EU members to move, you kind of move at a slightly slower pace, at the pace of those essentially who want to say, well, let's see if Trump follows through on this or that threat. That's exactly what they said with these, 10% tariffs that Trump was threatening against Denmark and its allies. He's backed off. But now there's a new threat as well. Remember, Trump is making new threats against EU countries this afternoon, and it's to do with these US treasuries, because we know that these pension funds in Sweden and Denmark have been dumping their US treasuries, and the latest from the Trump administration is that he says there will be big retaliation if this goes on. So the threat absolutely has not gone away, but again, we're always back to the same dynamic of the more cautious countries like Italy. Giorgia Meloni is saying, well, yes, we think Trump was wrong to do X, Y, Z, but kind of there's always this thing of kind of, let's see what happens, let's see what's around the corner, and then decide how we want to respond. And I get the impression that that's the sort of dynamic that is going to play out tonight again in this summit.
Has this past week been a turning point for 80 years of transatlantic ties?
I mean, I think it obviously has been, but the EU, because it's very much focused on these procedures, it's still working in this kind of old world order, as Mark Carney would have it, when the Canadian Prime Minister said at that speech in Davos, the old world has gone, it's not going to come back. But listening to the press briefing before this EU Council, it was very obvious to me that the EU is still very much in that old playbook, of going through the procedures, doing investigations, then seeing if EU member states want to follow the recommendations of the European Commission, etc., etc. The EU is just this kind of ship that doesn't move that fast. So unless there's something like this sort of coalition of the willing, in a sense, which did sort of take shape, didn't it, over Greenland with France and other countries sending warships and taking part in these military exercises, that kind of thing might have some effect. But if you look at the EU as a whole, as a block of 27 member states, from what I can see, the EU is still very much using that old playbook or the old rule book.
All right, May, thanks for that, Armin George. And this coalition of the willing, a term that's been used a lot when it comes to Ukraine. For more, let's cross to correspondent